very much, Nora. I really welcome the opportunity afforded to me by Alexis Fitzgerald and the Parliamentary Former Members Society to address such a distinguished gathering on the topic of Seanad reform. I want to outline to you, as a relatively new deputy, some of my observations of the way our political system works, what needs to change, how I believe that change will be worthwhile but difficult, but that in reforming politics and the political system, the reform of the Seanad as a viable political entity is a bridge perhaps too far. My basic thesis is that our republic needs political reform, but not necessarily Seanad reform. I, of course, jumped at the opportunity to address you, given the fact that speaking uninterrupted for 20 minutes in this chamber is a rare thrill. When compiling the thoughts I have on the issue of political reform, and in particular Seanad reform, I am struck by the fact that modern political discourse rarely affords people the chance to articulate a nuanced point of view. Stephen J. Wayne, in the book The Road to the White House, states that the average length of a quotation by a candidate on the evening news in the United States in 1968 was 42.3 seconds. Since 1988, it has been less than 10 seconds. Many estimate the reporter is now on camera for anything up to 7 times longer than the candidate. Politicians are now required to articulate complex, detailed, often difficult positions in a 6-word cliche. This leads to those in public life often being accused of not answering a straight question, of speaking like a politician, of not being capable of saying yes or no. There must be scope for a reasoned argument to prevail, for discussions to be had, to dispense with banal one-liners, and to discuss issues thoroughly. Not every question is entitled to a simple yes or no answer. Life isn't as simple as that. The recent debate on abortion legislation has taught us that many Irish people lie somewhere between the pro-life and pro-choice stances. It is valid and reasonable to occupy that space and to argue a particular position from a non-absolutist standpoint. In relation to the Seanad, therefore, I believe most people in public life lie somewhere between the abolitionist and reformist standpoints. When asked a simple question, whether you favour the abolition of the Seanad, the questioner often demands a yes or no answer. And if one must believe the Seanad, as if one must believe the Seanad, it is either perfect or useless. I occupy that middle ground. I lean towards abolition, but I'm also happy to be open to persuasion. That ability to be persuaded and to change a position has for some reason become perceived as a weakness in Irish public discourse. You're a flip-flopper. You're indecisive. You're making it up as you go along, are the common charges. Isn't it reasonable that reasonable people could be open to consider a reasoned position and to be open to changing their mind? Isn't that the beauty of discussion, of debate, of discourse? Politics is not the art of victory of one idea over another. It is the art of persuasion, the art of the possible, the art of conviction, but an art surely best engaged in with an open mind. When discussing political reform and the potential abolition of the Seanad, it is clear that the upper house has a PR problem. Viewed as outdated, elitist, irrelevant, and powerless, seen as a political nursery, a political retirement home, or even an A&E ward for politicians. The essential connectivity between the elected and the electorate is questioned. The limited franchise is criticised. The panel system from which most senators are elected is, to my mind, outdated and reflects a different Ireland to the one that I know. The fact that the agricultural panel, for example, elects 11 members, but the cultural and educational panel only elects 5, illustrates an emphasis that is unbalanced and in tune with a different era. But it is also unfair to paint only the Seanad as the house which is unrepresentative of Irish society. Critics of Irish politics and Irish politicians insist that we're all disconnected from the reality of Irish life. I have to admit that some facts speak for themselves. I often state that Ireland is made for someone like me. Male, white, Catholic, middle class, able-bodied, settled, heterosexual. History has proven in Ireland that if you are female, that life is just that little bit more difficult. If you are not white, life is just that little bit more difficult. If you are not Catholic, life is just that little bit more difficult. If you're not middle class, if you're a homosexual or transsexual, if you're a member of the travelling community, life is just that little bit more difficult. Bizarrely enough, the groups that I have just listed constitute a majority of people living in our democracy. Barack Obama has shown in the United States how an alliance of minorities can actually become the majority. However, it is still people like me who rule, and who have always ruled this state. The Dáil remains 87% male, overwhelmingly white, Catholic, middle class, heterosexual, able-bodied, and from the settled community. Is it any wonder that the vast bulk of legislation and budgetary measures disproportionately appease those who also fit into that demographic? Many women still feel unprotected by legislation and undermined in the court system. State provision of childcare is generations behind the accepted norms in other OECD countries. Traveller ethnicity is still not recognised despite Irish travellers having ethnic status in the UK. The LGBT community have had a long struggle for equality and are still unprotected by provisions within the Employment Equality Act, for example. Our incitement to hatred legislation is archaic and toothless, and public representatives will still engage in political posturing, pandering to those who are strong, blaming those who are weak. Even in the past week, an elected councillor in Donegal has stated that travellers should be kept together and live in an isolated community. A senator this week stated that he would rather use a local taxi driver than use somebody who is an obvious non-national. This is at best loose language, at worst pandering to the predictable power base. We must deal with the reality of this disconnection within Irish politics. A quick glance at the turnout figures in the last number of elections tells a sorry tale. The most recent election in February 2011, a mere 3 months after the arrival of the IMF, dubbed by many as the most engaging and important election in a generation, had a turnout of only 70%. If we look back over the last number of elections, the best turnout in the last 20 years was in 1997, when 76.5% of the population voted, with a quarter of those eligible to vote still staying at home. The 2002 general election saw a 62.6% turnout. The 2007 election, a 67%.
There. Could I just ask the person to identify whose phone it is and turn it off, please? It's up in that quadrant. Do you hear it? Sorry, Aodhan, yeah.
I think being a primary school teacher, you're well used to continuing when there's a hum in the room.
Carry on.
The 2007 election saw a 67% turnout. In a democracy where every vote counts, where constituents have multiple choices to make, where a ninth preference can be the difference between success and failure, those statistics show something that is deficient in our democracy. A friend of mine has recently moved to Australia and is active in the trade union and labour movement there. For him, the dynamic of compulsory voting is a fascinating one. Political activism adds the same weight to the rich as to the poor, the young and the old, the powerful and the weak. If that was the case in Ireland, I'm quite sure that politics and politicians would not pander to the type of lowest common denominator discourse we have heard too often in the past. This discussion about allocation of resources is an important one, and one which has huge political consequences. The area of education is a prime example as to how the allocation of resources and the scientific research bear very little resemblance. I have a particular interest in this area, having spent 11 years as a primary school teacher and then principal in an acutely disadvantaged area in the north inner city. The chart which I have actually distributed shows clearly the comparisons between state expenditure and brain development. It is a Scottish study, but its findings are replicated in Ireland too. We spend much more at the stage of life where the impact of that expenditure will be much lessened. But the expenditure is in direct correlation with the age brackets of those who vote. About 77% of the education budget is spent on the educators. As Fergus Finlay of Bernardos has outlined, we spend about €12,000 per student at third level, 10,000 per student at second level, and 6,000 per student at primary level. Until recently, we effectively spent nothing at preschool. Although the Hart and Risley report in 1995 showed clearly that the average vocabulary of a 3-year-old child from a welfare-dependent family is 400 words, and the average vocabulary of a 3-year-old from a professional family is 1,200. On average, 1 in 3 children from a disadvantaged area has a basic literacy problem. 1/4 of young mothers in some deprived districts suffer from maternal depression. A study in one disadvantaged community showed how 70% of children and senior infants choose their own bedtime. We have neglected the needs of poorer children. We have ignored the research that pinpoints best practice. We have not invested because there is no political advantage. This is the cost of the political disconnection and an unrepresentative democracy. The burden of intergenerational disadvantage is clear from a very early stage. I passionately believe that your history does not have to be your destiny. But as I have stated, the reality is that the political system often invests where the political need arises and not from where the research demands. My belief is that the Dáil, as the directly elected chamber of the people, has a huge body of work to do to reconnect, to protect, to empower, to inspire, to build a real inclusive republic. It is not possible, in my view, considering that task, to take on the reforming of a discredited Seanad chamber also. We must reform local government that is closest to the people. We must reform the Dáil and the workings of the Dáil. We must reform the Oireachtas committee system. I believe reforming the Seanad is a bridge too far. I say this reluctantly because the Seanad offers the Oireachtas a chance to hear voices who are concerned with matters of the nation and not those of a local constituency, to be representatives of the constituency of one, the one Ireland the Taoiseach has advocated in the past. But without that connectivity, without the popular franchise, its legitimacy will always be questioned. Its role as a scrutineer of legislation could more readily be taken on by an empowered committee system made up of elected members of the Dáil. There should, of course, be scope, as per workings of the strategic policy committees of local authorities, to co-opt members of civic society to Oireachtas committees to advise and give voice to the concerns of different interest groups. That would be a streamlined approach to governance and would, in my view, offer a better chance for political reform. As I have already stated, it is simplistic to blame the state of Irish political life at the door of the Seanad. It is also simplistic to blame this political system for the catastrophe that has befallen the state since 2008. It was a failure of political ideology, in my view, that caused the problem, and not the political system. The government is elected by those who vote, and those who vote generally know what they were voting for. I, for one, reject the concept that the government is the problem, that the free market should flourish unfettered, that regulation halts progress, and that taxation is a regressive concept or a shackler of individual freedom. There is an ideology that believes in the market solving all problems. If you lower your taxes enough, you can buy a bigger car, and we won't subvent public transport. You can pick a nice VHI, I almost said HMV there for a second, have a nice VHI plan for yourself and not worry about the public health system. You can send your children to a private school and not worry about the underfunded public school system. My experience has taught me that that logic doesn't stand up. It is socially divisive, economically unsound, overly individualistic, and undermines the concept of interdependency and nationhood from which public policy begins. A civilized society is not one where the poor man drives a big car. It is the one where the rich man gets the bus to work. I've already said that I worked for a number of years in Sheriff Street, which bordered the IFSC. One community that up until the 1960s depended on the docks for its economic lifeblood. Then the arrival of containerisation was akin to a mining town having its pit closed. Left entirely to the ravages of the free market economy, with destructive housing policy and poor social infrastructure, that community was left totally exposed to the harsh underbelly of unregulated activity, educational disadvantage, outdated skill sets, drug infestation, and broken spirits. Fast forward 40 years to the mid-2000s, and the IFSC was booming on the very site of the old Sheriff Street flats. Again, a poorly regulated, speculator-driven property boom. Everything is Anglophile. The local development authority, the DDDA, even goes into a financial partnership with Anglo-Irish Bank and purchases a site for 400 million. This unregulated system collapses, and the story is still unfolding. The €6 million project for my own school building is buried deep under the rubble of that collapse. The point is that society needs controls, needs direction, needs regulation for the common good. Government must be the force that underpins the vision for the republic that we have inherited. Politics is the art of that vision. Politics should not ever concede ground to the notion that economic theory should mirror the law of the jungle. but politics should always retain and enshrine what it does from the direct mandate of the people. I believe one elected body can effectively achieve that goal. That mandate will not always be flawless, as people are not perfect. We cannot blame the political system for having within it disgraced or discredited individuals that the people have returned to office time and time again. We have a responsibility as a society to challenge what I believe is the corrosive nature of the post-colonial hang-up that demands of certain communities to be beholden to a modern-day benevolent landlord-type figure. Allegiance to those who have clearly broken the law because of local loyalties or perverse hero worship of local pseudo-royalty is not in keeping with the Republican vision of interdependence and community. We cannot be a loose alignment of parishes jostling with each other for resources. We cannot persist with the notion of a minister for Waterford or a junior minister for Laois. We must be a nation and to take the responsibility of living in that nation seriously. In the past, we have defined their republicanism in terms of what we are not and not of what we are. We need to maximize the relationship between our citizens, our rights, our responsibilities, and our aspirations. But a political system like ours, effectively comparable population-wise with Birmingham, must be fit for purpose. Considering the work that must be undertaken, in my view, the potential to reform the Seanad to fit into that vision is limited. The reform of local government is where the real battle lies. The connectivity between the local taxation that residents pay, the representation they receive, the public services that they enjoy, is one that has not been a feature of public discourse at a local level and has a disempowering effect on the local democracy. The new property tax and the potential for councils to raise or lower the rate by 15% offers election hopefuls the chance to campaign on an ideological basis, to argue for property tax cuts over local services, or vice versa. The wresting of power from the non-elected management to the elected councillors will also help ensure that ideological arguments and positions are brought to the local community level. No longer can a councillor claim a local victory when the issue goes his way and blame the management when it doesn't. Our reform of local government is controversial, but it is the concerns of the community rather than the concerns of the councillor that are more important. Just as in the Seanad debate, it is the needs of the citizens that are paramount and not the needs of the senators. My belief, therefore, is that our democracy needs to be more representative, needs to base policy and allocate resources where the research demands, needs to connect more deeply with the electorate, needs to assert the importance of the concept of a collective interdependent society and of the role of government and politics as a force for good. That authority comes directly from the people and not through a filter. The work that I have outlined is so challenging as to render it also impossible in many eyes, but it is worth striving for. A truly representative unicameral chamber is an aspiration that can be achieved. I don't contend that a second chamber needs to be part of that vision. But as I have already stated, I am, as always, open to persuasion. Thanks very much.